Okay, we're live now, so whenever you want to start after, you can wait.
We're 4 minutes away from the official starting time. But people are listening, are they, Jay?
Yeah, there's some people already on YouTube.
Okay. Those that are listening already, I'm Kimball Cariou. I will be hosting this event today, Policing the Crash. We'll be hearing from a couple of presenters about issues around police surveillance, racism, technology, police brutality, all of those things that are deeply interconnected in this deeply disturbing modern age. We got a few minutes before the event officially begins, so everybody just hang in there and wait for us to start. All of those things. Afternoon, everybody. We're just waiting for a few more people to join this webinar on policing the crash. Lots of people still joining in, so be patient, give us a moment, but it won't be very long. Okay, folks, I think we're ready to begin. You're watching Policing the Crash. This is going to be a webinar on issues around police surveillance, police brutality, racism, technology, all of those issues in the context of the current economic crisis in North America. We'll be talking about both Canada and the United States. With a couple of folks who are deeply interested in researching these issues and having a conversation about it and answering some of your questions. My name's Kimball Carew. I'm hosting this from the Center for Socialist Education in Vancouver, which is located on the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples of this part of the world, the Tsleil-Waututh, the Squamish, the Musqueam, all of whom have lived here for many thousands of years. We are deeply honored to be working and living on their territories, the territories where they welcome the settlers to this part of the world. And we are all in solidarity with their efforts and the efforts of all other Indigenous peoples here in British Columbia to defend their lands, to protect their waters from colonization, from imperialist exploitation, to resist the resource extraction and export policies which are devastating the planet, including right here in beautiful British Columbia, which claims to be a leader in environmental policies and reconciliation with First Nations, but the actual story, of course, is quite different. So here we are. We're going to hear this afternoon from two speakers, and then there will be some conversation. Kayla Hilstob is a trade unionist, anti-imperialist, organizer of socialist education events here in Vancouver. She's a PhD student at Simon Fraser School of Communications and a researcher at the Digital Democracies Institute. Her research looks at the deep historic and current relationship between the military and the technology sector, as well as automation, big data, and labor, and how these issues interconnect. D.W. Kamish, Dalton, is a PhD student at Simon Fraser University and also a researcher at the Digital Democracies Institute who teaches critical theory and technology. This talk will be based on research undertaken for their MA thesis entitled Infrastructure and the Black Panther Party Toward an Infrastructural Politics, and a forthcoming book chapter. So Dalton is going to open with some remarks about the Black Panther Party, police brutality, technology, anti-imperialism, and then Kayla will speak to us about neoliberalism, technology, the military, and the current moment in Canada. So I'm going to start it off with asking Dalton to take it away. Let's hear what you have to say today.
Great, thank you. I'm just gonna take a second to share a couple slides. I'm not a huge fan of doing PowerPoints, but when speaking about the Black Panther Party, I feel like it's really important to show some of the artwork from the newspaper, so I wanted to do that because I think it really illustrates a lot of interesting, provocative things from their history. So first, I just want to say it's really nice to be here, even if it's just through a computer screen. I wanted to thank the organizers, of course, and Kayla for inviting me to join this conversation. My name's Dalton. And so this little talk that I'm going to do is based on some research I did for my MA thesis and some more research that I'm doing for a forthcoming book chapter. I'm going to present a very brief and selective account of the Black Panther Party's thought and practice related to policing, insofar as it speaks to, I think, some contemporary concerns about technologized surveillance that Kayla will discuss. And I just wanted to say at the beginning that it's difficult to speak of the Black Panther Party in general or in generalities, as the party itself manifested differently between the national leadership and local branches and at different times in the party's 16-year history. The period that I've studied most closely is from the party's founding in October 1966 to March 1971, when the party was fractured by an FBI-exacerbated conflict between Huey Newton and Eldridge Cleaver, which is arguably the most active and significant period of the party's history. That the Black Panther Party was founded to combat police brutality against Black Americans is pretty well known. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale founded the party as the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, which indicates this orientation. In 10 points, their platform demanded self-determination, full employment, reparations and an end to exploitation, housing, education, exemption from military service, an end to police brutality, the release of all prisoners, and trials by a jury of their peers for the Black community. The final 10th point summarized their demands. Quote, "We want land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace." The first thing that Newton and Seale did as the Black Panther Party was get guns. They began spontaneously following police officers in the streets to protect Black residents and their communities from brutality. And this continued until the passage of the Mulford Act in 1967, which repealed open carry gun laws in California, making the Black Panther Party's practice of policing the police illegal. The first issue of their newspaper was catalyzed by and addressed to the murder of Denzel Dowell by police in nearby Richmond. Consequently, the Panthers were subject to massive surveillance and violent repression. An Emory Douglas cartoon published in the May 18, 1968 issue of the Black Panther newspaper, anticipating another long, hot summer of uprisings in cities across the US, depicts a, quote, riot watcher computer. The accompanying article describes two computers located in the Justice Department, stuffed with data, that will become the nerve center of federal riot watching activities. Readers of the newspaper are encouraged to overwhelm the computers by rioting not just in a few cities, which could be easily contained by police, but by conducting guerrilla warfare in every city at once. While the cartoon depiction isn't an exact technical diagram, and it's not far off though, the article is very accurate. The previous January in 1967, the FBI's National Crime Information Center began operations. It consisted of two IBM System 360 Model 4D mainframe computers connected via leased Western Union telegraph lines to various types of terminals in FBI field offices and local police departments across the country. The September 1967 FBI Law Enforcement Bulletin reports that at the time, the database contained over 260,000 records, 20,000 of which were wanted persons records, and that daily communications with the central computers was nearly 10,000 entries and inquiries a day. Given that 233 out of the 295 FBI COINTELPRO operations conducted against Black activists during this period were directed against the Black Panther Party, it's certain that this newly technologized state surveillance system was deployed against the Panthers. The National Crime Information Center is one key historical antecedent to practices that continue today, as the police and FBI use social media, facial recognition software, and cell phone tracking to arrest Black Lives Matter protesters and organizers, for example. This historical parallel is unsurprising, as Simone Brown reminds us that racism and anti-Blackness undergird and sustain the intersecting surveillances of our present order. The National Crime Information Center is one link in a chain of policing that stretches from the Middle Passage to slave patrols to modern-day surveillance. I just want to finish this brief talk by emphasizing the embeddedness of the Black Panther Party's opposition to police brutality within a wider anti-imperialist decolonial analysis, largely indebted to Malcolm X and Frantz Fanon. This analysis posited that Black Americans were a colonial population, an internal colony kept under control by state violence in the form of police. In response, the Black Panther Party demanded community control of the police, which was far more radical than I think it sounds today. They envisioned that police would live in the communities they patrolled, accountable to the people they protected. And this represented one mode of self-determination for the Black community. Moreover, the Black Panther Party's ultimate enemy was American imperialism. Following a colonial analogy, they argued that the police were the military arm of occupying colonial imperial power. Local police in Oakland, California were no different than American Marines fighting in Vietnam. So when the Black Panther Party demanded community control of the police, this was an attack intended to destabilize the American state as such. And that's all I have to share today. But I think some of these issues will reappear in the conversation that we're gonna have after Kayla's presentation. So thanks.
Okay, thanks very much, Dalton. Fascinating stuff to look back at the origins of the surveillance of the Black Panthers, which I think, as we'll discuss later, is part of a bigger pattern of police surveillance of radical movements throughout the history of this continent leading up to the present day. But now we're going to hear from Kayla. Take it away. And after that, we'll have some good conversation about these issues.
Okay, hi everyone. As was mentioned, my name's Kayla, and I'm really glad to be here to be presenting and having this conversation with you all. So thanks for being here. I don't have any slides, but I'm just going to sort of jump right in. So I just want to begin with foregrounding that surveillance and policing has been integral to the development and maintenance of capitalism throughout history, both in Canada and the US, as Dalton pointed out. Whether it's surveilling Black Panthers or slave catching forces in the American South, or in Canada, where the police force would later become the RCMP, the one that forcibly removed Indigenous peoples from their lands. So with this legacy and the continued continuity, I'm going to focus more so now on the modern context. And I'm going to give sort of a brief overview on neoliberalism and economic crisis and how it relates to the development of militarized technology, how we got to this point. And I'm really going to focus on the Canadian context because I think quite often it's pretty overshadowed by what's going on in the US. So I want to point out that usually conversations about modern policing and militarization and technology start with 9/11. And it's true that their expansion occurred right after 9/11, but we actually really need to go back a couple more decades and then land on the dot-com crash in 2000 first. So up to this moment, remember, we were dealing with the neoliberal legacy of Reagan, Thatcher, Mulroney, and obviously that was carried on by their more liberal counterparts shortly after. And just to step back for a second on neoliberalism, I'm going to use Jody Dean's definition, which I really like, which is an overarching collection of policies that favor corporations to restore their class power over us, the working class. So as capitalism ages, crises become more damaging, and the capitalist class must restore the conditions for continued expansion out of the ruins of crisis. So neoliberalism is essentially a pro-corporate political economic policy that was a response to the economic crises of the 1970s. And I emphasize this because many economists and scholars and activists will say that, well, neoliberalism is the problem rather than capitalism. And that shifts away really the focus from the root of the problem, which is our economic system in general. And so this policy shift was a necessary and inherent stage within the development of capitalism and can't be separated from the system as a whole. But more specifically about neoliberalism, it included the gutting of public infrastructure, breaking of unions, and mass privatization. So in Canada during that period, we saw the privatization of Air Canada, Petrocan, the Canadian National Railway, essentially giving away this public wealth and infrastructure to private companies so they could make a profit in the wake of a crisis. And this kept things afloat and expanding for a while. But then the dot-com bubble burst in 2000, where we entered yet another economic crisis that came from excessive speculation on the technology sector, and the newly developed World Wide Web stopped becoming a viable place to invest at the time. A lot of people lost a lot of money. As I mentioned, capitalism needs to find new sources of profit to expand, to adapt, to grow. And if the web isn't a sector where capital can expand, then something needs to change. And at this moment as well, George W. Bush enters office in 2001, and he inherits this economic crisis. So to jumpstart the economy, just as they did in the 1980s, they begin to privatize and neoliberalize the military. This includes everything from private military contractors such as Halliburton to contracting out dining services on bases. And then 9/11 happens. And this privatization then includes massive expansion of the military and security state under the guise of fighting terrorism at home and abroad. So this included mass public investment into private firms to increase capacity for surveillance, data collection, and analytics by the government as part of this overall project. So millions upon millions were invested in services such as biometric identification, video surveillance, web tracking, data mining, facial recognition, and the list goes on. So many of the features that power our smart devices today essentially first received their cash injections from the government to fund the US war on terror, a criminal undertaking that I'll add that saw 1 million Iraqis alone killed. But I want to focus specifically on one company today, and that's Palantir. Some of you may know it as the big data analytics and data mining company that has a relationship with the State Department in the US that's behind the ICE deportation machine. As a startup, it received a large investment from the CIA in 2003, again, as part of this privatization of the military. And this private company was commissioned to build a system that compiled dispersed data sources to make connections that systematically helped military planners avoid roadside bombs, track insurgents for assassination, and even eventually capture Osama bin Laden. So from the military perspective and Palantir's perspective, this was a big success. Obviously devastating to people of the Middle East and to the working class there. But not long after, Palantir brought back their software and integrated it into other aspects of the US and world economy. So this included massive contracts and partnerships, both in private and public sectors. Contracts with insurance companies, the World Food Program, police departments, banks, all kinds of government agencies. And even recently, they partnered with the Trump administration to track the spread of COVID-19. So in order to do this, they need access to vast amounts of data from the government, for example, that includes employment, education history, phone records, biometric data they've collected, driver's license info, whatever government data, you name it. As well, they use public social media data, YouTube data, LinkedIn, whatever profiles you have, Yelp, you name it. So essentially what Palantir does is mine data across government, social media, police, immigration, all these different areas, and then they use their software to make sense of it. And so that's essentially what's happening in the US. So the context I'm describing at this moment is the American context. And again, remember, they do this to everyone. So not just someone who's suspected of a crime, not somebody with a criminal history, but everybody. And so I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later, but I want to talk about the significance of this and what it means for Canada. So recently, Palantir set up a Canada division in 2019. So until then, they were unable to operate in Canada because we have laws that ensure data collected about Canadians is stored on Canadian servers and on Canadian soil. But this all changed when David McNaughton, then Canada's ambassador to the US, resigned and became the new head of Palantir's Canadian operations. And it's still early days for Palantir in Canada, though Calgary police are now using their software. So they scrape publicly available social media and other online content. They have access to financial records, credit scores, credit histories. They say that they have access to email and other telecommunication information. Essentially, they do all this to build profiles, again, to implicate people in some kind of suspected criminal activity. And this is just some of the data we know that they're using. There could be much more. And they also have deals with IBM, I want to note. They use their social network analysis tools. So as Dalton mentioned previously as well, they had contracts with IBM in order to surveil Black Panthers, similar as in the Calgary police are using today. So, I mean, this in itself is worrying enough, though I also want to point out that there are numerous studies that show that these methods are not accurate, they have flaws, and they provide openly racist results. And there's so many examples I can draw on, but I'm just going to touch on a couple. So for example, someone's postal code can act as a proxy for race. So meaning if you live in a neighborhood that's poor, you will be deemed more likely to commit a crime. And those neighborhoods are historically Black, Indigenous, Asian, or other racialized groups due to the ongoing historic legacy of white supremacy and exclusion. So this is essentially racial profiling. One more quick example is that facial recognition technology is extremely inaccurate on Black faces, meaning that algorithms are trained mostly on white faces and cannot detect Black faces accurately. But despite all of this overwhelming evidence of flaws and racism and inaccuracies, Calgary police are already using these methods, and Palantir is now looking to further expand their presence in Canada. And I'll note that the public pays for these contracts. And so there's one more element to this equation that I need to mention, and that is where this data is being stored. So the companies that we recognize, such as Amazon and Google and IBM, and the ones who are among the most wealthy today and arguably in human history, they are first and foremost data storage companies. So these companies are worth more than the banks, more than retail giants like Walmart, worth more than oil companies. And they earn their money through data storage contracts with governments, military and police, and of course, private companies. And the others I will note, the other big wealthy companies such as Facebook and Apple, the ones at the top of the Fortune 500, they are also involved in this, right? They're data collection companies. We might call them surveillance companies. They're also monopolies that really expanded after the 2008 economic crisis. I just wanted to mention John Bellamy Foster and Robert McChesney, who pointed out that even by the end of 2010, the internet had come to play a central role in capital accumulation, with the major means of wealth generation on the internet being through commercial surveillance, the platforms that I discussed. So these tools, again, of data collection, data storage, data analysis, continue to expand more and more in civilian life because it's profitable for capitalism. These technological systems work because they collect and store everything from our day-to-day lives. So this is the premise of big data and smart technology, that an algorithm can identify your face at a protest, for example, because it has looked at 3 billion faces and knows how to identify a face from that training. And this is a real example, by the way. Clearview AI is a company that has a database of 3 billion faces, and 20 Canadian police forces use this software, including the RCMP and the OPP. Similarly, Palantir software knows when someone's profile, according to whatever criteria they've set, can be deemed as a threat because they've analyzed millions of other profiles that they consider to be not a threat. So yours and mine and your parents and your siblings and your friends. So one of the key takeaways here, I'm going to start closing now, is that 9/11 was the catalyst, not the cause of the expansion of the surveillance state. So the structures that were put in place around the time of the War on Terror have become integral to capital accumulation and will be expanded as crises continue. I want to finish briefly by looking at the defunding and prison abolition movements in relation to what I just mentioned. So these movements have really taken off and become absolutely explosive after the recent events with the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, Chantel Moore, Regis Krasinski-Paquette, and all the other innocent people murdered by police across Turtle Island last year. So what I've hoped to show is that privately owned surveillance technology as integrated with the police and military is a huge problem. It's siphoning away funds from actual public services, where our municipalities are being starved and held hostage by the ever-increasing financial demands from police that are becoming more and more militarized. And every time they get their way. And so what I wanted to show here is why. Essentially, it comes down to capital accumulation, that these billion-dollar, sometimes trillion-dollar companies that I've named are deeply reliant on this data collection, storage, and analysis, these contracts. And of course, capitalism is structurally racist and colonial, relying upon the continued theft of Indigenous land, the dehumanization of racialized people in order to exploit their labor and continue to justify imperialist destruction and occupation of a third world. And this militarized expansion of police on Turtle Island takes the same character. So the capitalist class is not only benefiting from eliminating who they see as threats, right? Indigenous peoples, Muslims, migrants, other people who are targets of imperialism, but they also profit immensely. So as we've seen, these companies are among the top Fortune 500 now. And just a little recent history as I get to the end here, is that the RCMP and the Canadian military and CSIS have all admitted that they surveilled the Idle No More movement, a movement led by Indigenous women with a call for refounded nation-to-nation relations based on mutual respect. They grossly exaggerated the potential for violence, and in their internal documents, they even called the movement a bacteria, a disease that has to be eradicated. So now with private companies involved in this surveillance, turning a profit from it, we can only imagine how such efforts on the part of the colonial state will increase. So essentially defunding or even abolishing colonial police, such as the RCMP, has to be a struggle fought alongside the struggle for socialism. That in order to achieve this goal, we need to build enough working class power to challenge the forces of capitalism, to challenge this profit motive, to challenge the imperialist police forces that continue to develop this technology, who first test it out in the third world and then bring it back here to deport people, to police people, to deny our insurance claims, to ensure the banks make more money, and the list goes on. So now we're in another economic crisis, the worst one in human history. And so we must continue to resist and build these movements that challenge this military, technology, and policing recovery, and instead invest in public wealth, people, education, housing, healthcare, transit, so, social services, you name it. So I think I'll end here. And I know there's a lot that that was mentioned. There's much more to say, right? We can talk about how this technology created the gig economy, how it's entered workplaces to surveil workers. And so we can bring that into the conversation, hopefully for the next little while or so. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Kayla and Dalton, both of you, for placing this issue in the context that we need to look at it today. People in Canada sometimes might look at the issue of policing as though this is something that just cropped up in recent years with a number of cases of police shootings, particularly of people from the Black community or Indigenous people in Canada. But actually, as you point out, this is an issue that goes back a long way. I can think right here in Vancouver over 100 years ago, there was an assassination of an immigration inspector in Vancouver because he was involved in sending spies into the South Asian, the Sikh community, right into the Gurdwaras at the time to gather information on radical Sikh movements against racism and British imperialism. So this is certainly not a new story to this corner of the world in any sense of the word. It goes all the way back to the early origins of imperialism entering Turtle Island and colonizing these parts of the planet for their own interests. Kayla's conclusion, I think, also referenced one of the questions that's already come up on the chat whether people are in favor of simply defunding the police or more radical approaches to the whole question. I would think most people who consider themselves socialists are in favor of a different type of society, one in which there are no longer any instruments of capitalist control of the population, whether it's police, prisons, spy agencies, the military. Frankly, it all has to be ultimately abolished. The only real question is how we get there. What are the strategies for creating a society that can really move in that direction? Could I ask you both to comment on that sort of trajectory of policing and how we got from the age when there were simply undercover cops who took notes and carried them from meetings back to some police office to today, where we have spy capabilities that are virtually unimaginable, trying to monitor disruptions of the capitalist order in North America. Just to give people a sense of how things have progressed over the last 100 years or so. Either of you want to have something to say about that to begin with?
Okay, I can jump in really briefly. Yeah, it's a great question. And as you point out, like there has been a huge transformation. And I guess the point is that it's not a new phenomenon, as you said, right? And as I kind of pointed out, police forces were created in the US to catch escaped enslaved people, RCMP, remove people, Indigenous peoples forcibly from their lands. And more over this time frame, as Dalton's presentation discussed very well, and maybe you can bring this in as well, that technology has kind of been the forefront of policing people, right? So whether it's developing the National Crime Center, as Dalton pointed out, or even the internet itself was a tool of the US military. A lot of my research is on how the Canadian military used the internet as well, and they were developing their own internet in order to surveil people during the Cold War era, specifically people that they saw as a threat to the Canadian state, which were the Quebec national movements, the Indigenous movements, communists, trade unionists. And so they explicitly say in their internal documents that they want to develop the internet to survive any potential attacks by these so-called threatening groups. But then I think when my talk was mostly trying to focus on how 2000 was a pivotal moment when now you're having private companies getting these contracts. And so when you see this emergence of like how capitalism has sort of taken on these projects in order to profit from them, that's when you see this massive expansion and continued use of like digital surveillance on people that isn't really going to end until we can make this break with capitalism.
Yeah, I think that's really insightful. And I guess something that I would emphasize, I suppose, is to say something that has become kind of like glib or even passe within like where Kayla and I are located, which is like communication studies, is like, well, yeah, the internet was funded by the military, right? It's always been a military technology. And so the question of like, how this development happens is like almost not really a question to begin with. It's like, this was the history of its development to begin with, right? It's not like there's some convergence, some like new convergence between new technologies and the police and the military and surveillance, right? It's that these technologies were developed from the start for these purposes and for the most part.
Kimball, you're muted.
Unmute. Thanks to both of you for that. And we'll get back to some of those points. Just in terms of one of the things Kayla said, it's very interesting how these things connect. In the early 1950s, the RCMP was tasked by the federal government in Canada to set up a program to track the professional functionaries of the Communist Party of Canada. This was at a time when they were terrified that communists were Soviet agents and plotting to overthrow the state, vastly exaggerated. So it was called the Pro-Funk program. They started out by actually collecting information on the homes that party staffers lived in, what vehicles they had, what exits there were from their homes, what family members lived there, because they actually had plans. If it was ever necessary to round people up, they wanted to be able to do it as efficiently as possible. Over the next 20 years, that program expanded to include 50,000 names, everybody from Tommy Douglas to anti-war activists to people in the FLQ, the Quebec Front de Liberation de Quebec. When the War Measures Act was introduced, that was the list they used to round up 500 people in Quebec, most of whom had absolutely nothing to do with the FLQ, but these lists were very handy just to be able to collect people that they could say were potential enemies of the state. So maybe if you could comment a little bit about how data collection necessarily expands to deal with all sorts of targets that may never have been the original so-called enemy that they were going after.
Yeah, I can jump in. Yeah, I mean, I kind of touched on this a little bit about how basically how big data works is that you collect everything. You have to collect, all profiles, all photographs, all email communications in order to train a model to be able to understand how to pick out the so-called anomalies or whatever they deem as threatening or whatever. And so, as you pointed out earlier, Kimball, in the 50s, they were doing that. And nowadays it's like built into the model. Like you can't have a Palantir that only, collects data on people who've committed a crime, because the models wouldn't work, right? And there's something else I wanted to point out that you talked about really briefly, is how they surveilled communists in the 1950s. And I'm sure they're surveilling communists today and all over the world. And Dalton and I were talking about this earlier, about this sort of, what does that mean for us as communists or as activists or, however you identify. And a lot of times we get pulled into this idea of security culture, right? That we need to be using Signal and we can't organize over Facebook chat and we need to have everything encrypted and secret. And I just want to point out that this is not the angle that we're looking for, right? We're looking to build a movement against this whole monetization of surveillance and within the capitalist system, right? So that is a lifestyle choice if you want to use Signal and you want to use DuckDuckGo and move away from Google and everything. But just as any other lifestyle choice, that's not a revolutionary position, right? You can be a vegetarian, you can grow food instead of having a lawn, and that's great, but that's not going to solve the problem, right? So as activists, we need to be involved in mass movements. We need to be organizing where the people are. We need to be using open channels of communication in order to build a movement. So I just want to point out that, security culture is really not the way to go here. Instead, it's to build a movement against capitalism.
Okay, we're starting to get a number of good questions addressed to our presenters here. Maybe I'm going to start bringing out a couple of them that we've received here. For example, somebody wants to know, can you comment on the extent to which data on Canadians is collected in the US? And does this allow a circumvention of privacy laws in this country and the use by police agencies here of data stored in the US? So there's this cross-border connection, or how this is connected to the whole question of privacy laws. Does all this make these laws virtually a mockery, or are there other angles to this that you could comment on, either of you? And I understand if you're not experts on privacy laws, I mean, this is a pretty complicated area of the legal system, the legislation and so forth.
I think I could speak to it briefly. So there's a couple interesting cases. So for example, Clearview AI, the company that I mentioned, their business model is facial recognition, and they train their models by scraping data available on the web, so public data. So this American-based company scrapes Canadian social media profiles or whatever other areas you have photos, and then use that to build their model. So because it's publicly available data, they somehow get around this model, though I did read in the news recently that it was determined by Canada's privacy commissioner that Clearview AI violated the privacy of Canadians. Yet there's nothing that they're doing about it or think they can do about it. So that's one of the problems. Also, as I mentioned, there's a law that Canadian data, any data collected about a Canadian has to be stored on Canadian servers on Canadian soil. Though as we saw, Palantir, an American company, what they did was just, okay, we're going to set up a Canada division and build servers in Canada. So they, it's kind of a loophole. They just got around it, right? It's an American company, but physically they are storing the data in Canada. And lastly, the way the internet is built and the way it works is that data is transmitted essentially across the world in some cases. So, I mean, I'm on Zoom right now looking at Kimball, who's 40 kilometers away, but quite often this signal is transmitted across all different towers, even routed through the United States. So even like privacy laws, they're very focused on where data is stored, not how it's transmitted. So this signal is going through the United States, right? And it's just the very nature of how the internet is built and how it works. So, you can't really deal with that. You can't legislate that.
Sort of how it looks to me too, as an amateur on this. Dalton, do you have anything to add to what Kayla said about that? Or should we move on to
not
another?
much. I'm neither an expert on privacy law nor Canadian myself. I do think that Kayla's point about the focus on storage is really interesting, actually, that transmission is this sort of sticky problem, it seems like. But it's also like seems to be often a cause for like techno-nationalism or something like that. That like it often seems to institute this drive for like national internets, or like that, at least in the US, seems often motivated by like anti-Chinese sentiment. It's like we can't have our internet traffic going across the world because we don't know who's going to be watching it, that sort of thing. Which of course is like mobilized to strengthen the other sort of like national surveillance apparatus.
Yeah, interesting. Speaking of sort of techno-nationalism and the Canadian context, we have a question here. Could we address the way Statistics Canada hides factual information by simply refusing to keep records based on arbitrary criteria that the public plays no part in creating? So I'm trying to wrap my head around that question and exactly what it means. But if either of you wants to comment on that question, we can do that. And then we got a couple others that people have submitted. No, you're trying to figure that one out too. Maybe another.
I can give it a try. I can give it a
Sure.
try. So, I mean, I'm not exactly familiar with StatsCan or what or how they collect their data. But I mean, it is known that, for example, several police forces don't collect racial data, right? And they don't collect it on purpose, right? They don't collect how many arrests by race or carding by race. And so, you know, they make certain things visible, hyper visible, that they want to be shown, and they purposefully, you know, hide other things. So I can't really speak specifically on Stats Canada, but I mean, it is a technique that surveillance companies do, or record keeping companies do, or Stats can. I just can't really comment too much on that otherwise.
Yeah, here's another question then. Both of you referred to Palantir. We have somebody who's submitted a question about Palantir and the issue in Palestine, with a link to an article from the Haaretz newspaper in Israel outlining how the Israeli defense forces and security establishment jail Palestinians who fit so-called terrorist profiles simply by combing through their social media posts. This is probably not surprising for anybody who's ever been familiar with Palestine solidarity work here in Canada, that Israel would do such a thing. But maybe you could say a bit about this whole question of how states like Israel, Canada, the United States use such techniques, simply picking up on social media to pigeonhole people into these definitions of being terrorists or security threats, and Palantir being one of the outfits that takes part in this. Either one of you, any thoughts on this? And should we be afraid of posting anything on social media? I mean, I know myself from discussions with various friends here in Vancouver. It's a frequent thing. For example, the NDP as a political party is known to go through people's social media postings to see if there is anything whatsoever regarding Palestine solidarity. If you want to be a candidate for the NDP in an election, you're pretty much required to take down anything like that, to apologize for ever having done it. So it's not just security companies or the state that's involved in using social media to monitor people's activities and control them, but it's even one of the main political parties in this country, which is supposed to be based on ideas of social justice and democracy and freedom. That's a pretty frightening commentary on the kind of country that we live in my opinion, at least.
Yeah, I can comment briefly on that. So, I mean, yeah, Palestine solidarity is one of those things that, you know, already marks you as, you know, some kind of subversive or a threat. Or, I mean, even under Canada's Bill C-51, if your activism is somehow antithetical to Canada's interests or Canada's allies' interests, which would be Israel, right? You're already sort of implicating yourself. And, you know, that's how these algorithms and these software companies, they work, right? So building these profiles, right? You haven't committed any crime, right? All they're doing is suspecting that you committed a crime, or that they're suspecting that you could be involved in terrorist activity. So that's how you got, you know, 5-year-old children on no-fly lists in the United States, because, you know, obviously they're not involved in terrorist activities, but because of their data profiles and how it was configured, they were assumed to be implicated in something. So, you know, it's absolutely, you know, does not mean that you've committed a crime, or that, I mean, even ICE, right? So they use Palantir's software in order to decide who should be deported. And, you know, there's quotas, and there's huge amounts of people that get deported every day, or arrested, at least incarcerated. And their success rate of, like, their accuracy rate is actually like quite low. I believe like less than 50% of people arrested by ICE are actually undocumented people, right? So these profiles, they just implicate people in criminal activity, which more often than not, they haven't committed.
Very interesting, very scary. Dalton, do you have anything to add to that
Yeah, I think
discussion?
something that I might add as well is, again, that like this is it like, while these sort of new algorithmic technologies exacerbate the sort of what I think is now called like predictive policing often, it's not in itself a new technology, right? Like we know from the history of policing that this has long been an approach that, for example, being Black in the US makes you suspicious already to police, right? And so I think it's important to like remember this sort of long history of policing and this long history of surveillance that is now being automated, right? Which I think is sort of important when interrogating these technologized systems that we encounter as being very new, right? It's important to interrogate them as actually grounded in these sort of very old and long histories.
Yeah, that's interesting about digitizing and technologizing this stuff. I remember very well some of my own personal history. I was in Saskatchewan during the 1980s, working in Regina as an organizer for the Communist Party. And we worked with people like American Indian movement folks. Saskatchewan has a very large Indigenous population, a lot of them quite radical people. There were people who had been associated with Irish liberation movements, left-wing trade unionists, people involved in the anti-apartheid movement. It was a very lively left scene in Saskatchewan at the time. And one day, somebody who my partner and I had known from activity around the university in Regina, the Students' Union there, came to us and said that she had recently got hired by a government, an arm of a government crown corporation called the Saskatchewan Property Management Corporation. And the official role of this body was to protect government property from being vandalized or damaged or whatever. But she said the most interesting thing was they had a big room in the Saskatchewan Property Management Corporation offices full of filing cabinets, including a lot of files on potential security threats. And she said they foolishly, because they weren't very efficient at this thing, they had her working in this office, and she had access to these files. And because she knew a lot of people who were activists, she started looking through on her lunch break, and she said, "You know, Kimball, your file was one of the biggest." So that's very interesting. What sort of stuff? And she told me anything that was in the news about demonstrations I was at, or leaflets, or news releases involving any of these other movements who were cooperating in one way or another, it was all in there. And at the time, presumably not digitized, but it was such a fascinating look into, the mindset of the capitalist state. It was a conservative government in Saskatchewan at the time, but I doubt those files were shredded when Roy Romano became the premier. That would have been surprising. So yeah, that's just my own one of the experiences from my life on how this stuff goes, and it gets to a question that somebody posted here because it relates just as much today. Somebody asking, what are good practices for organizers to help build movements and organize as broadly as possible while still being mindful of security issues? And the comment from the questioner, we should have both security culture and mass movements and keep encouraging others to maintain stronger principles to one's own ability. So can each of you comment on on how this plays out today? How do we act as activists in this world where we know that this sort of monitoring goes on?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think no matter what, so first of all, we can't be deterred, right? We can't be deterred from, sharing our opinions and giving these talks and resisting the colonial state, resisting, all kinds of oppressions by capitalism and being open and vocal about it. And so, yeah, I mean, I think as somebody mentioned in the chat, right, about this idea of both security culture and mass movements, I think, yeah, like as long as it's not exclusionary, like as long as we are, still being open and we're still using platforms that people are comfortable with, and we're still holding open meetings, and we're not afraid. That's the most important thing. I think we shouldn't be deterred, and we just shouldn't be stupid. We just need to be vigilant, right? I mean, the Communist Party and other communist parties around the world and all kinds of social movements have survived the massive Red Scare and surveillance, of the Cold War era. And they did it by being vigilant, right? And they went underground when they had to, but overall they were very open and looking to grow. So yeah, that's just my comment. Being vigilant and understanding that we did survive this history and we will survive continually.
Yeah, I would add, not from any position of authority as an organizer, but rather just perhaps some lessons we might learn from the history of the Black Panther Party as well, right? Is that on the one hand, Huey Newton, for example, early on in the party's history, really emphasized the importance of being open in a public party. There was a lot of sort of conflict early on in the party about going underground. And as the leader of the party, Newton emphasized that it was irresponsible in some ways to like go underground prematurely, because then how would the people find us, right? And I think that this concern remains today in certain ways. Like Kayla and I were speaking about this yesterday, I think it was, like that. Yeah, I like the phrase that Kayla's using, like being vigilant, right? Because I think the sort of there is a possibility of inducing a sort of paranoia, right? Like, which is not productive in certain ways. And again, is like really, its sort of destructive effects is really illustrated again by the history of the Black Panther Party, where the FBI was able to sort of exploit the paranoia of the party and their leaders to exacerbate conflict between them. So yeah, I think that's really sort of important to keep in mind. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really fine line to walk sometimes. You want to be, very careful that when you're holding meetings or planning activities, you're not doing something that's going to unnecessarily draw the attention of the state. But you do have to be able to organize openly, not hide from the people, to use that quote. If you're serious about organizing people for social change, it can only be done out in the open where people can see you and find you. If you only ever meet behind closed doors where nobody can see, you're not going to get very far. But as history shows, whenever you're out in the open, the state will probably try and take advantage, find ways to step up its surveillance. So vigilance and wisdom is key, and sometimes you only learn those things through bitter experience. So we often get on the left people who will say, well, you should be able to pick out the cops in your movement by the way they act suspiciously. Well, maybe sometimes, or maybe sometimes they're just people that are really enthusiastic and they want change now, not 20 years or 50 years or 100 years. And that's a good thing, people shouldn't assume that just by being slow and careful, we're going to get where we need to go. So we have a couple other questions or comments that have come up. One about Palantir. As somebody's pointed out, Palantir secretly tested their predictive policing models in New Orleans. The city council didn't even know. And I think that's, you know, an important point. Sometimes politicians are completely out of the loop as well. You know, I mentioned the RCMP surveilling Tommy Douglas a few minutes ago. Well, Tommy Douglas was never any threat to the capitalist system in Canada, but he was an honest guy who stood for world peace, for, you know, some degree of social justice. He was largely responsible for Medicare being implemented in Canada against very powerful capitalist interests. So that didn't stop them from surveilling him or other politicians who were not at all radical. There's a question here. Are Palantir, etc., exaggerating their claims to scam contracts? Recent reports show Palantir's vaccine tracking went unused. It was actually less sophisticated than conventional medical data. So is this a point worth commenting on? Do these security firms exaggerate how much real information they're collecting and how useful it is simply in order to get contracts to keep on doing it? You know, is this a natural tendency in the surveillance industry? Any thoughts on that?
I think it's a great point to think about. Looking at targeted advertising, for example, on social media companies. Dalton and I were just talking about this yesterday about how, all this money is being poured in data, and all these private companies want to buy data so they can do targeted advertising on social media. But actually, these ads are not very accurate. You know, we will often see that we get ads for something, strange or weird that we would never buy. And so, I mean, it really shows that all of these claims made by targeted advertising and these abilities are quite over exaggerated. And I also think, it's a big problem in tech as well. Look at Elon Musk, right? His company continues to make all sorts of promises about space travel and rockets, and we see them constantly blowing up in the media, right? So I think, similarly with Palantir, right? I'm not really familiar with that exact case, but I would not be surprised if they too are over exaggerating what they can do with their data or with their software that analyzes data.
Yeah, I would add as well that it seems my sort of intuitive response would be that it serves a sort of dual purpose as well, right? Like there's, we're not strangers to this history of new technologies being over exaggerated and everything, right? And so on the one hand, it seems to it emphasizes the power of the state, right? Which is a scary thing for people, right? And I think that does significant work that shouldn't be ignored, right? They're not exaggerating these claims just to get contracts, but it serves this other function of exaggerating their power, which makes people afraid and that sort of thing. But additionally, they are getting contracts, right? And I think one of the really insightful things about Kayla's presentation is that these contracts are being awarded to people with very close ties to the government, right? They probably already know that the claims are exaggerated, right? But it doesn't matter because it's keeping money circulating between these people who are just kind of putting their hands in each other's pockets the whole time.
Yeah, there's material interests at stake in this stuff, profiteering going on. And on one level, the quality of the information is absolutely irrelevant as long as people have, high-paying jobs and big fat contracts to do this stuff. They're quite happy to keep on doing it. And in fact, they have to expand how they're doing it, regardless of whether they're doing it well or badly. The main point is that they are, profiting off the whole thing. Um, there's, you said, Dalton, you wanted to, this, I guess this would be a related question, a question to Kayla about productivity and capital accumulation and how that relates to all this stuff. So can you get into that to ask Kayla what it is you're getting at here?
Yeah, sure. So I think, I think one of the like impressions that is pretty common or popular when we're talking about surveillance is the sort of like big brother social control idea of what surveillance is and what its purpose is. And I was rereading Simone Brown's book on surveillance yesterday, sort of in preparation for this conversation in my talk. And she does a sort of brief literature review of surveillance studies, sort of the scholarship in that area, that by and large finds that surveillance is very infrequently about this type of social control that we imagine it's about, but is more often about increasing productivity, right? Both on a sort of micro scale, like in the workshop floor, but at a sort of macro scale as well, right? Increasing productivity overall. And I'm wondering, Kayla, if you might speak to, like, if you might speculate on ways in which the operations of Palantir are increasing productivity, if they are. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, Palantir specifically, I mean, I'm doing research on its relationship with Amazon, right? And so Amazon stores Palantir's data for the ICE operations. And so this deep relationship of these two companies, really shows that the Amazon warehouse operates very similarly to the ICE prison. So that's my research area. So I wouldn't say per se that like Palantir itself is contributing necessarily to this whole productivity race, but certainly its partnerships with companies like Amazon who, algorithmically track their workers and fire them for certain demerits that they get. So things like, how long it takes to make a delivery, things like the amount of bathroom breaks you take, even the most basic, human dignity issues. So yeah, I think it's hard to separate Palantir from all these other contracts. So I would say taken as a whole, absolutely, right? It's to make workers more productive. I mean, we can look at self-tracking as well, right? Everything from a Fitbit to, dieting apps, all of these things are methods of self-surveillance to achieve some kind of goal. And this goal is usually in line with the capitalist productivity or somehow self-perfection that fits into capitalist standards of patriarchy or whatever it is. And all of these devices, of course, that you wear to improve your own performance, all that data gets sent to these companies as well, right? Quite often.
Yeah, that's really good. I think something else that I'm really interested in is like, that I think your work is building towards is like understanding much more precisely the capital accumulation and profit models of these companies. And I think that the way you contextualize, the rise of these surveillance apparatuses within the growth of neoliberalism is really insightful. And I'm thinking in particular of David Harvey's concept of the spatial temporal fix, right? Like where capitalism, like it invests a certain amount of productivity into things that get stuck at a certain point, right? And it over accumulates money that needs to spend somewhere else, right? So it goes somewhere else to spend that money. And then the sort of like profit model kind of needs to like catch up until it gets stuck again. And some scholars talk about like social media in these terms as a digital spatial fix. And I'm wondering if we might add this like surveillance apparatus alongside social media in that regard as another one of these fixes that that the capitalist mode of production and the state sort of like cooperate in trying to manage the crisis, right?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's a really great point. And I kind of wanted to take that and maybe extrapolate it a little bit when we look at imperialism, right? So we might look at the macro scale here. And one thing I found really intriguing about your presentation when you ended off with, these connections between, the Vietnam War and surveilling and policing Black populations and the Black Panthers in particular. So I don't know, can you maybe comment further on the links between surveillance and big data and tracking and capital accumulation and how it functions within the imperialist framework?
Yeah. This is actually kind of the same question that I was going to ask to you in a certain way, because perhaps to sort of continue the point that I was trying to make earlier about like this sort of popular idea of surveillance as this sort of big brother social control thing. Part of that is I think it makes it difficult to imagine how this is profitable, right? It's like, well, in what way is this aiding in capital accumulation, right? To like throw a bunch of people in prison and to deport them and stuff. But I think if I were to speculate, like my intuition would be that it has a lot to do with like global labor markets, right? That like in this period of like massive globalization, which of course, is like the other side of the coin of imperialism, right? That when the price of labor needs to be like forced down in a lot of ways. And my guess is that like the ways in which mass incarceration is profitable, right? One of these ways is probably by forcing down the price of labor, right? Because it institutes what is essentially modern slave labor in like incredibly low waged prison work, which like in the context of imperialism is this sort of like really insidious way of perhaps like American companies competing on like the global labor market. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, that's one of the great goals of imperialism, right? To keep this underclass of workers for, what we love to call globalization, or what people love to call globalization, when in fact, it's neo-colonialism or just straight up colonialism. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, looking at these companies, like especially Palantir as kind of in the case study here, right? It was funded by the US military, right? And so, fighting imperialism is also fighting police in Canada now, right? It's indistinguishable in a sense. And so, these struggles can't really be separated. And I think that's a really important point to think about when we're seeing how all these struggles really do converge in a capitalist system.
I want to take it back to an earlier question, because the whole issue of resistance against policing, surveillance, and so forth is sometimes moved in a different direction by people with other agendas. We had a question along these lines. What do you say to people who say that the police, despite some corruption and human rights abuse, are still a necessary evil due to murderers, rapists, organized crime, and so forth? So we sometimes do hear the argument that some of this surveillance is necessary to catch the bad guys, or even that we have to do the surveillance ourselves to catch the bad guys. I have neighbors who are involved in various neighborhood watch kind of things, where they try and lure people into committing criminal activities so that they can turn them over to the cops. There is this idea that people have. In my own housing co-op, there was a proposal that we put up surveillance cameras all over the building so that we could catch whoever was breaking into vehicles, and somehow that this would make our lives better, that we could turn this this footage over to the cops, who would then find the people that were breaking in and clean up our neighborhoods. So there is this kind of mentality that's out in the public, because people do have this fear of various types of crime. So I'm interested if you could comment on that type of thinking and how it relates to the popular struggles that we've been talking about here. How do you answer these kind of questions, Dalton?
The way that, like, personally, that I respond is sort of a two-pronged response. Like, that, to begin with, this is like a sort of well-established phenomena in communication. I think it's called like the bad world phenomena or something, like where on the news all they talk about is crime, so that people think that everyone outside their door is a criminal and there's crime happening all the time. There's so many bad guys out there, right? Which is just not true, right? Like, I think first, the amount of crime that happens is like exaggerated for the benefit of increasing police, right? And then second is that the police aren't very good at doing their jobs anyway, right? Like, they don't solve that many cases. Like, it just doesn't add up.
Yeah, I can jump in too. Oh,
go ahead.
Just that, I mean, on that point, like, it's all the evidence points to the fact that policing doesn't solve crime, right? It doesn't prevent crime. And the police, they're not these, good-meaning, well-meaning TV cops that we see who are just relentlessly solving rapes and murders. And that's really just not the case. Policing is designed to protect private property. And that is basically, what the police are after. So, I mean, even the statistics on, horrific crimes such as rape, that only 1% of rapists ever see the inside of a jail cell. So we can say that this system is not working, right? And that they're not actually here to prosecute people who do such acts, but instead to make sure that, the system of private property is maintained. And so I would say that we need to build alternative policing, right? People's policing is sort of Dalton's presentation on the Black Panthers talked about.
Yeah, I found the debate in my housing co-op was very instructive in this regard. Part of it, I live in a fairly progressive community, my housing co-op. People are, quite a number of them social justice activists and so on. But there's also always some level of fear that, the others are out there. That's who's breaking into our cars, smashing the windows to steal our cassette tapes or, whatever it was. And given that I live on the edge of the downtown east side in Vancouver, you can imagine who people fear as the others. There's always sort of a racist edge to this. It's going to be Indigenous folks, poor folks. We had very interesting conversations about all this. One of the things that helped was to actually, for example, calculate out how much would it cost for high-end surveillance cameras to produce the kind of footage that might actually be able to capture somebody's face on it, assuming that whoever broke into your car wasn't wearing a hoodie. And, what is the realistic chance that anybody on the police force would be able to use these images? What are they going to do with them? Like, wander the streets of, Commercial and Hastings looking for, this particular face? It was utterly ridiculous. And people could eventually see that, we were the people who were suggesting the full-scale surveillance of the building. We're talking about spending like 10 times as much money on cameras and so forth as the cost of simply replacing some broken car windows. None of it made any sense whatsoever on any level, but it was a useful exercise just to get people to sort of zoom back and think about, what it is we're trying to do, what kind of society we want to live in, what would really help things in our neighborhood, like what social policy changes would mean that it would less likely for people to want to break into your car. What sort of changes in policing to reduce the impact of policing that give people a hard time? It raised all sorts of interesting questions for our little community. And that brings up the question somebody asks, what do you think of the Jane Jacobs idea of eyes on the street, that prior to gentrification and displacement, people are invested in the community and look out for one another? This is something that's also related to what we're just talking about, the eyes on the street model. Can you give us some thoughts on that?
I'm not familiar with Jane Jacobs' precise formulation of this, but it doesn't seem so. I might be able to speak to like the Black Panther Party's conception of community control of the police in this regard, that like one of the major problems that they identified with the police is that Black communities were policed by a white police force who did not live in their community, right? And of course, the colonial relation is really explicit here, right? These white police officers who have, the authority of the state to inflict violence upon these people come from without, arrive in the community, beat people up, and then leave at night, and they face no consequences for this, and they have no social ties to the community except for inflicting violence upon them. And so what the Black Panther Party wanted, their vision was that at different sort of deeply segregated cities where neighborhoods were segregated by race, they envisioned that these segregated communities would have their own police forces of people who lived in the community and were the same race of the people that they were policing. And the thinking here is that when communities were policed by people who actually lived in the communities, the people who were policing the communities would have social ties to the people, and that as a result, they would also have some sort of obligation to this community. They would face social consequences for what they did in this community, and they would be held accountable to that community. I think one of the cartoons I showed, it depicts the sort of really ugly pig surrounded by community members, right? And so the police force would, I'm forgetting the details, but I think the head of the police force in the community would be elected by community members, and then they would be accountable in that regard, and that sort of thing. But I'm not super familiar with Jane Jacobs' writing on that, but.
Jay, our tech guy here, put up a link to that, but Kayla, you wanted to jump in at this point and raise this from a different angle?
Yeah, I mean, just very briefly, I don't know much about Jane Jacobs' formulation either, but just, if we think about it as a neighborhood watch that funnels or pipelines people into the prison industrial complex, right? That's not exactly the solution we're going for. And I don't know exactly if that's what it is, but I'm just cautious of these sort of, solutions that reinforce incarceration. And we know that incarceration is, particularly in Canada, Indigenous people are incarcerated at 10 times the rate of non-Indigenous people. So, we have to be leery of that. And so that's why I want to point maybe to the Cuban model of maybe I wouldn't even call it policing, but of, neighborhood care. And that's where they have offices for the defense of the revolution on every street, on every neighborhood, basically on every corner, that deals with community issues in a non-policing way, right? So issues of domestic violence, for example, aren't treated with police and punitive punishment, but dealt with as a community, right? People know what's going on in each other's homes, and they're there to support each other, and they check in on each other, and they offer community support to each other and try to resolve it in ways that don't further harm the community and further, reinforce inequalities, gender inequalities, racial inequalities, et cetera.
Yeah, here in North America, that Cuban model or similar things in some other countries, these are presented as, terrifying, nanny state or, Orwellian types of community surveillance. Your neighbors are watching you, and it's, in light of what we've been discussing here today and what we all know about the type of surveillance technologies that really exist, it seems so absolutely benign, a society where neighbors actually watch out for each other's interests, compared to what we have here today, where we're quite sure that there are security agencies listening for particular words in our telephone conversations or email messages in order to track and monitor. The real problem is so much bigger than this scary thing that we're told about the way socialist societies do these things, or the way that the Black Panthers were trying to come up with new ideas for protecting communities 50 years ago. I was also reminded while you were discussing some of this, these ideas about community control of police, they actually go back much further. In North America, when police forces were introduced in major cities, there were usually things like strict local laws. The police had to actually live and reside in the communities where they were policing. And there was, attempts made to actually enforce these laws. Over time, what you saw was this separation as the police became sort of a separate caste of people, hiring among particular ethnic groups, whatever. There's the stereotype of the Irish police in places like New York and Boston. And as salaries went up, more and more they tended to find ways to live, outside the areas where they were actually working, in higher income communities outside the municipal boundaries. And the separation between the police and the urban populations, especially in racialized communities, became wider and wider. I don't know statistically how that's true today in a city like Vancouver, for example, but clearly this is an issue that goes back a long, long ways in North American society, and probably in other parts of the world as well. Any thoughts on that sort of historical trend? Maybe not so much. I think we've gone through most of the questions that were submitted online. It might be about time to try and begin wrapping this up. Any final thoughts that either of you have on this general issue, which is certainly not something that's going to go away? So can you take a few minutes each, and then we'll say goodbye to our viewers here. You don't have to both go at once. Go ahead, Kayla.
I can just jump in, sure. I think the key takeaway here is that, for at least from my presentation, and certainly there are links with Dalton's as well, is that capitalism needs surveillance, capitalism needs police, and now that it's so deeply embedded in our centers of capital accumulation, it's not going to be easy to get rid of it, and of course, as a movement, we have to fight for reforms, and that involves being on the ground in the defund the police movements and the prison abolition movements. But we have to remember that this is so much bigger, right? We've demonstrated there are links with imperialism, there are links with labor, with colonialism, and it's so deeply embedded that, I really see this as in part a struggle for socialism. And these these issues all converge around the capitalist system. And so I think, especially in this economic crisis, it's now more than ever so important to be politically active, to be building working class movements, to get involved, wherever you can, and understand that in a crisis, policing and surveillance absolutely is expanded, not only to surveil whatever threats there are to the system, but also essentially to accumulate capital now. And so we need to be very, very vigilant of that. And so that's kind of where I might leave it. Maybe Dalton, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would just add as well, like, as someone who's been studying the Black Panther Party for a few years, I guess, at this point, and continues to study them. I think it's really important to emphasize, like you've emphasized, the way in which their analysis of the police is grounded in the colonial analogy, right? Which necessarily leads us into understanding the police and opposition to policing, surveillance, mass incarceration as an integral part of anti-imperialism, right? And that these sort of local, these are local manifestations of sort of global trends that need to be opposed, right?
The United States as global policemen, that kind of
Right.
mentality on the small scales. Who else has the right to send drones to kill these dangerous criminals in every corner of the planet? Only US imperialism, apparently. Although as it becomes easier to make drones and arm them, this could go in a very different direction in our world, in a very dangerous way. So, well, I want to thank both of you for your presentations today, and also to thank Jay Watts, who's been providing the technical assistance, who helped set this up and monitor the questions for us. That's one of the reasons we're able to do these sort of presentations through the Center for Socialist Education, is Jay's wonderful help to those of us who are less technically inclined and capable. So keep an eye on us. We'll be holding more of these events as we go on, probably even after the pandemic, because this is such a great way for people to get together across British Columbia, across the country. So take care, be healthy, stay vigilant in your movements, keep struggling for an end to the policing that is affecting all of our movements and our communities. And we look forward to working with you in the fight for socialism and justice and liberation as we carry forward. Goodbye to everybody.